The third vision of quantum physics that was described was Bohr's vision of quantum physics. According to him, quantum physics is only a symbolism to predict results of experiments done in a laboratory at a macroscopic scale. And recently there has been a development of this conception, this very, very minimal conception. It was by Chris Fuchs and the people who claim to have a conception they call QBism, namely quantum Bayesianism, saying that quantum physics is just a probability anticipation of the results of experiments. So it's very, very minimal. Second question.
So just one at a time, please.
Yes.
I am still jet lagged, so my mind
yes.
is...
First question. Yes.
Not because of food, but because of too little sleep is not as...
so, and
cannot hold more than one question at a time.
Yes.
So basically, my model would have an interpretation which is closer to the superposition of the last two. In other words, an informational, in other words, let me put it in my terms. Quantum physics is the model of a set of experiments done on what we believe to be physical reality, because we, in fact, are the ones that believe that certain states exist that we put into the equations of physics, okay? Therefore, what we get out of it is a certain set of results, which then go into a formalism, into mathematics, and we believe that the world is that formalism. Not all of us, but many physicists believe that that is all that reality is. Now, I'm saying, no, that is simply what appears to us based on information gathered in an information field, which would be the I space, okay? And it is the model that we construct in our mind. That model is what I call P-space. P-space is, of course, each physicist has a different P-space, but then by talking to each other, we agree on a common P-space described by that model with the states that we are imposing on that physics, and we say that's what's real.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your short and clear answer. Professor Pregnolato, can you...
Go ahead. Okay.
Yes.
Usually, when we talk about quantum physics, we generate quite a confusion, because quantum physics started in the 90s, in the beginning of the 20th century, from Max Planck, and then developed a lot till the 20s. And after that, as said Vitiello, we see the transform of quantum mechanics to quantum field theory. And from that, many interpretations of quantum mechanics has been proposed. And in this field, we still see new interpretation of quantum mechanics. Four are the most common, but we continue to see new interpretations. So when we try to apply this kind of knowledge to the study of the mind, it's easy to generate confusion, because what kind of quantum mechanics we are using, what kind of interpretation we adopt. So when you see the several models of quantum consciousness, you can find that many authors adopt one of these interpretations of quantum mechanics. There is the many words of Everett that is completely different from the Bohm interpretation of implicate order. So it depends on when you are talking of quantum consciousness. It depends on what kind of interpretation you are adopting.
That's right, yeah.
Probably the physics didn't solve yet the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so by reflex, we are still confusing when we use the word quantum consciousness, because at the moment we have not reached an unambiguous definition of quantum consciousness. I think that this is the first time that I'm listening the interpretation of a genie, and I think that is very interesting. I need more time to understand all the details of his interpretation, but it's very interesting.
Yes.
And we are moving towards a new interpretation, maybe, of the connection between quantum physics and consciousness.
Thank you. So maybe now I just want to raise the second question, which is for all of you, because this was especially for specialists of physics. Now the second question is much more about consciousness. So my question, very simple question: what is consciousness according to you? What is the mind according to you? Or maybe there is a possibility. If you cannot give a definition of it, maybe you can say, it's a free answer, that consciousness is beyond definition. What do you think? Maybe I could start with the specialists.
Yeah, the problem is what I was supposed to say tomorrow, so if I say today, then you are cutting the grass under my feet. Okay, I won't tell everything then, just a little bit. So I think as often some of us point, people will say when it comes to consciousness, we are in a muddle because we say we don't know how to define it.
Yes.
The reason is we try to define it in terms that it doesn't apply to consciousness. So of course we are in trouble to define consciousness if we squeeze our mind to try to define it in a way other than pure experience. You start from that, and then you see how the rest of your understanding of reality comes from that. And as you know very well, we were just talking in the break about the idea that how meaning comes in. One of the questions that people say, well, if you say that consciousness is primary and that outside of consciousness there's nothing you can talk about, well, of course, first this is true. So people say, well, what about a world that is pure rock? There's no life, there's no nothing, or the time of the Big Bang, and so, but are you negating the existence of thousands of millions of billions of worlds which have absolutely completely bare sort of no obvious sign of possible consciousness? But that very question doesn't make sense because there's no meaning to that. So of course you can talk about it. No way. You cannot represent such world without consciousness. So it is not a genuine question because not only there's nothing to talk about, there's nobody to think about, so it is irrelevant. It doesn't mean that those worlds don't exist in some way, but just it's finished. That without consciousness, there's nothing else.
Yes.
So it's like the idea that you could step out of consciousness to study it doesn't make sense.
Yes.
You say, I'm going to get out of space to see what space is really. And then you move, you take a rocket, you go further, then you still have space in front, on the back, below, and everywhere in the 10 directions. So you can get out of space to describe space.
Yes.
So that is, I think, to say that the basic experience, the clarity, as opposite to total lack of experience. You could say that, that's why we give the quality of luminous to consciousness, not that it shines in the dark, but because it illuminates everything we can think of, whether inner world, outer world, or both of them interconnected, while what we call an object from its own side, which of course, again, does it exist as it is in its own side? We don't know, but from our perspective, we think, oh, this loudspeaker doesn't have consciousness. We can say for our sort of relation to that, what crystallizes in that interaction as a loudspeaker is dark in terms of knowing, because it doesn't know anything, at least to our perception. So in that sense, I think the luminous quality of knowing is the basic nature of consciousness. And then everything else is this sort of correlation, description, and things we try to make it more complicated.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. So maybe I can summarize also saying that even imagining a world which is a part of the world which is completely devoid of consciousness is an act of consciousness. And
no meaning.
No meaning, exactly. Yes, maybe Rinpoche.
I will add it a little bit on what Venerable Mathieu already have said. Pure theoretical point of view, from the ancient Indo-Tibetan Buddhist understanding about consciousness, here I think it is quite important from what I'm talking about. The consciousness and the mind are quite often in the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition treated as a synonymous. Slightly different usage of terminology, otherwise it will come into the same meaning. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing here is what's different from the consciousness or the mind from the matters. The difference comes from the consciousness has the potential to be experienced, to be aware of the things. The matters, the physical world does not. And that is the difference between the mind and the matter. So quite often in the Buddhist literature, consciousness is defined in this very simple term, clear and knowing. It has a principle or the quality of clarity to things to be clear to himself or herself, to the individual. Because when you talk about consciousness, again you need to think about the individual. Without taking into account the individual, the experiencer, you can't talk about consciousness. According to the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there isn't some kind of consciousness hanging in somewhere in the space. Consciousness is, or consciousness existed within each individuals. So we need to also take into account the individuals when you talk about consciousness. So the consciousness is defined in the term of clear and knowing. Clear is more contrast from the matters, and the knowing in the contrast to be aware of what's around, or to be experience what is around. And that's a very basic Buddhist, Indo-Tibetan Buddhist definition of what is consciousness, clear and knowing.
Thank you very much. Marcello, do you want to answer this difficult question?
Sure. But I'm a neurophysiologist, so I'm supposed to give a brain-related definition of consciousness, but I won't, because I fully agree actually with what's been said right now, because we've been trying to squeeze out consciousness from the brain, from the matter of the brain, looking for neural correlates of consciousness with not much success so far, I have to say. So the way I would start, and probably we should start in neuroscience also, is from a first-person perspective and from introspection, from axioms, phenomenological axioms. That's what we know. All the rest, it's a postulate. And then, so I would, to answer the question and be short, now we can go on the long conversation, but what I would answer, as far as I'm concerned, that consciousness is what is fading, or it's greatly reduced when I'm fully anesthetized, well anesthetized, or in dreamless sleep. I'm not even dreaming, so consciousness is synonymous of experience. Anything, like pure darkness, to the most complex and luminous state we can experience, and it's vastly rich and incredibly variable. That's its richness. And then, as a neuroscientist, of course, I have to look for signs of consciousness in the world, because I have to do it for ethical reasons, not because, even if I'm not so curious, I have to do it because for instance, there are many examples, but we are saving many patients who are surviving devastating brain injuries right now. And we normally assess consciousness based on input-output relationship with a functionalistic approach, like, I say, squeeze my hand. If you do that, I say, well, you're conscious. If you don't, I say, well, maybe you're in a vegetative state. Stephen Loris will talk about this tomorrow, I think. Mm-hmm. But with this approach, we don't admit that consciousness can be there, that subject can be, without doing, without responding. So I need to find other ways to assess consciousness in other person, because I'm sure about my consciousness, as far as I can tell, but I can. So, well, as a neurophysiologist, I have to do that. So what do? I start from phenomenology. Based on phenomenology, I try to not even derive. I start from axioms, that is, how is consciousness? What are the fundamental properties? And then I look for, in the world outside, in the physical world, for systems, mechanisms, whether they are at the quantum physics level or, more macroscopic level, that can account for these properties. But that's an inference. It's just, the best of my knowledge, because I have to, anyways, make decisions in real life. But I start from a phenomenology.
Thank you very much. It's very important indeed. And I think many neurologists start from phenomenology without really noticing it. So it's important that you tell us. Thank you. And can you, Professor Fagin? Yes.
Okay, I can give you my, again, I'm going to define consciousness from my point of view, as opposed to listing various interpretations of consciousness. And the way I arrive to that point of view is through extraordinary experiences of consciousness. Therefore, I arrive to that through inner experiments.
Yes.
So it is an experimental way to understand what consciousness is. So for me, consciousness is the fundamental capacity of what exists, which is, call it being, call it energy, call it whatever you want, to know itself. Now, what does it mean to know itself? To know yourself, you first have to have an experience. So at the foundation of consciousness is the capacity to experience. Okay? How do you experience? By feeling. So you have to have feelings in order to have an experience. But feeling is not equal to knowing. To know, you have to get the meaning that is inherent in the feelings. That requires the need of symbols. Yes. That's how matter arises. Yeah. Matter arises in the effort of conscious entities that are part of this beingness. They want to communicate with each other. In order to communicate with each other, they have to create symbols. The symbols are carriers of meaning. So, I send a symbol to you, but first I have to encode the meaning in the feeling that I have into a symbol. And I send it to you. In this case, I don't send anything because you have direct consciousness as direct perception of the totality of what exists. This is before it is incarnated, before human beings exist. This is the level of C-space and I-space interaction as I described earlier. So I create symbols. Those symbols are clearly identified as my creation, but they have a particular aspect. They are distinguished as symbols as opposed to my actual beingness. Yeah. Because if I'm a conscious being, I perceive the totality of energy instantaneously. in each self, there are symbols, there are ripples in the energy of the being that has this energy that is self-reflective. Therefore, when I perceive the symbols, if I have empathy, which is a quality of consciousness, I can understand the meaning of the symbol and we can have a communication.
Thank you.
Therefore, reality, physical
Yes.
reality is a byproduct
Yes.
of the need to communicate
Yes. Mhm.
of the selves
Mhm. Mhm.
and the fact that by communicating, the selves know themselves.
Good.
Because a conscious self perceives the totality of what exists as self, but also perceives itself as the observer with its own unique self, identity, perceives itself as the observer of that totality, which is also itself. That is the conundrum
Yes.
that is actually embedded into the symbology of I-space, which is quantum physics. In quantum physics, you have the superposition of states.
Mm-hmm.
You have the superposition of the observer and what is observed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where the rubber meets the road. That's why quantum physics is necessary, not sufficient, but necessary to have a symbolic system that embodies consciousness.
Thank you. So may I summarize a little bit what you said?
Yeah.
But I think, strangely, it's quite similar to what you said. I don't remember your name, but Deshi, yes. So why? Because you said consciousness is essentially a combination of experience and knowing in so far that you are symbolizing.
Knowing is the meaning of the experience.
Exactly, the meaning of the experience. So it's quite similar to the idea that consciousness is a sort of combination of clarity and knowing, which he said.
Yeah, but
Now,
it's
of
also,
course, you have to-
it's important because
Yes.
it's also one with the beingness as well. So it's not separated.
Yes.
That's
Okay,
why
okay.
see,
The combination
that's
was a
important
little bit
to
too
see that
quick.
that is a totality,
Absolutely.
is a fundamental property of energy, but energy carries all those properties as aspects of itself.
Also, knowledge, to go on this idea, is also a way of discriminating some parts of our experience from one another. And this discrimination is, we can attach to the parts which are discriminated our symbols. There is a very well-known theory of symbols which was formulated by Fernand de Saussure. Mm-hmm. And he just said that the differences of what we perceive are symbolized by the difference of the sound of our words. So the discrimination we make in the field of what we experience is symbolized by the difference between the words we use and the words that we can communicate. So I think there is...
Yeah, but it's also, discrimination depends on the comprehension of who receives the symbols.
Yes.
So it is also contextual. It is not an objective. That's the whole point. Physics believes that there is an objective world and that everything is objective. They believe in objective probability.
Absolutely.
That's why I said I believe in subjective probability, for example, which is Fuchs',
Okay. Yes.
Fuchs' idea of probability.
Yes. Thank you.
In other words, the meaning of a symbol to me
Yes.
is not necessarily identical to the meaning of the symbol to Professor
Professor, yes.
Exactly.
So can you tell, you want to
Yes,
react?
I just one small remark. When you say that experience and understanding come with this kind of sensation, then symbols of meaning come out. I would argue that these are already secondary steps. This is not the most primary definition you could make. According to at least to Buddhist analysis, we would say that the most basic one is a self-illuminating non-dual sort of luminosity, yes. Mm-hmm. So that time there's no sensation, of course, and there's no meaning other than just pure awareness in the sense.
Well,
we give the example.
The luminosity is an
Yeah,
experience.
so we give the example.
It is a sensation. It is a feeling. luminosity
Well,
is a feeling.
Probably it's a question
How
of
do you know that it's
terminology.
luminous if you don't have a feeling?
It's a question of terminology.
No, but it's important that we agree on terminology.
We
because
call feeling something different. But one thing I
fine,
want to
if you call
ask.
it different, then I classify anything that is an experience.
Yes.
There is sensation, feelings, but the feelings are body feelings, emotions, thoughts are feelings, in the sense that you have an image before you transfer that image into words, just symbols. And spiritual feelings are feelings. They are all qualia, as far as I'm concerned. So it's a question of definition.
But to have that, any feeling you might imagine, you first need a basic quality of the faculty of knowing, the bare faculty
That's
of knowing.
exactly right. That's consciousness.
And that is self-illuminating, just like a flame doesn't need a second flame to be illuminated. It has the faculty to illuminate itself. It doesn't need a secondary source. So that's the most primary, it's pure awareness devoid of content. So there's no question of feeling this, feeling that, certainly not your body, where it's very far down the chain of mental constructions and mental events, yes?
Yeah. But in fact, I said that consciousness, in the most concise way, is the capacity of being or existence or self, whatever you want to call it, to know itself. That's self-reflective. That's self-reflection. That's self-illumination. That's what it is.
Yes, but to have self-illumination, you have to have illumination in the first
have
place.
what?
Illumination.
Yeah. That's
That
right.
means-
Illumination.
Okay.
But it's self-illuminating.
Okay, so it's
I
what
said
Matthew
self-illumination,
said.
which is
Let me-
it is exactly
Yes.
is exactly what you're saying.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
there is no difference here. But the self-illumination can also come via symbols. So the symbols are like mirrors of self-knowing. So in other words, the purpose of physical reality is to function as a mirror so that you can reflect your own self-knowing into the structures, symbolic structure of physical reality.
Yeah.
But the purpose is for self-illumination, for self-knowing.
Yes.
That's my model. I'm not.
But we were just precisely discussing with Mathieu about the possibility of certain states of consciousness in which you are not yet analyzing anything. You are just in the presence of the clarity or the illumination or something like that. So it would be interesting to
the
hear.
surface of the mirror capacity, before it reflects any image, it has to have that capacity. Or you take a crystal which shines rainbows, but if it's in the dark, it has this potential, but it is not yet unfolded. So the bare reflecting capacity of the mirror is sort of the basic consciousness. Then everything, meaning, symbols, comes later elaborations.
The mirror is part of what exists, and what exists has this capacity to self-reflect.
Thank you. Okay, maybe.
There is no mirror.
Yeah, you want
No,
to.
I don't want to. I mean, if there are other questions.
Maybe, we don't have too much time. So I suggest now we ask the people in this hall to ask questions to the speakers. I think, so we have to devise a method for that. Maybe I think the best method is just raising the hand. So I saw first you and second you, okay? Yes. First him. And
Yes.
I will also turn. Yes, you.
A very simple question to the panel. In your view of consciousness, is there space for machines that are conscious? In particular, I'm asking this to Professor Fagin. So in his theory,
Thank you.
is there the possibility of having artificial intelligence machines that are actually self-conscious? I'm asking this to understand if the biological aspect is necessary in your view, and actually I'm curious also about the Buddhist view of consciousness, if there is the possibility of self-conscious machines.
All right. According to my view, artificial intelligence and robotics based on classical computers, classical systems, cannot be conscious. living systems are not classical computers and not classical systems. They're quantum systems, and as such, they can host consciousness because there is coherence from the elementary particles all the way to the organism, which in a computer is broken between the elementary particles and the symbol, which is called bit. The symbol that is called bit is actually a statistical property of a certain arrangement of matter. Okay, so it has no connection, no continuity with the wave aspect of particles, elementary particles, where consciousness kind of doesn't reside, because everything resides within consciousness, within this energy that creates the symbols, but requires this coherence all the way down to the consciousness units, which are the first emanation of the void. So that's within my model.
Thank you. Maybe Mathieu, you want also to say something?
Always they speak of the ideal Turing machine. Yes, you could not distinguish. I really like to love to meet one of those. They haven't got to the point yet, but I have a few questions for that Turing machine. One of them is, can you describe the pure experience of consciousness when you don't have any thought? I mean, any mental construct. What it looks like. And I think the Turing machine said, I don't know what it will say, but I'm curious. And no, I know, but so I think there's a set of questions that could unmask that. You know, the famous machine that thinks, you say, hey, are you worrying when someone's going to remove the plug? Are you worrying about that or something like that? Or precisely, you know, what is the state of your mind when there is no mental construct? Can you describe that? So in a way, I don't know. I mean, it's maybe not as a simple machine, but the so-called one that would perfectly mimic human consciousness, the famous Turing machine. I cannot understand how this sort of construct will be able to experience that direct experience of these most fundamental aspects.
If I can add a word on this kind of problem, but before that, I apologize myself, first of all, with Mr. Scheierman, but also with you, because I was kept in an interview and I missed the sense of time. I'm sorry. I apologize also with you for being late. Concerning the question, consciousness has to do with the freedom. What I mean is that if ever could be possible to construct a machine with consciousness, I say that because there might be different position if such a possibility is achievable or not. Then at that point, I wrote in a paper, if such thing could be possible, we should call that machine Spartacus. Because at that point, the machine will not be anymore a machine in the proper sense. Because a machine which does not do what you want, you say that is out of work. You put a sign and you call management or assistance. So there is an intrinsic contradiction in the idea of doing that. And it happened to me, now you know me how to say, take things, to a talk, at the question of a talk of a very good, very nice project on this European brain project. At the end, I asked, why you should do a machine with consciousness? Just do a baby. It might be even more pleasant.
Okay, Tashi wants to maybe can you bring the microphone?
So, because my knowledge about robot and the intelligence is very limited, what I want to say a few words is, from the Buddhist point of view, certain levels of consciousness can be perfectly functionable without this body. There are certain levels of consciousness can be perfectly functionable without brain system, according to the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So therefore, for the Westerners, having constantly debating whether robot can have consciousness or not, because it's mainly talking about Western understanding about consciousness, or the mind is mainly discussing or thinking about brain function. For the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it is perfectly possible consciousness can function without physical brain system.
Thank you. May I just add a little story, because I discussed with a guy who claimed that you can have conscious machines. And I asked him, what would you call a conscious machine? And the person said, a machine that is able to perform certain cognitive functions, such as self-knowledge. Okay, so there is a sort of recursivity or a sort of metacognition, as they say. Okay, and so I asked, how would you know that this machine is conscious? And the person just asked, if this machine performs the function, then by definition, it would be conscious. So I think there is a sort of circularity in the criteria for ascribing consciousness to those machines, and that's the reason why, personally, I doubt very much.
Yeah, I think this is precisely the issue here. Like, again, it's the functionalistic approach based on input and outputs.
Yes.
But in principle, you can have, say, I don't want to go back to patients, but it's always useful to do so, like locked-in patients or fully disconnected patients who are perfectly conscious, but in completely zero by the input and output behavioral point of view. And then you could build perfect zombies, like even the computer with machine learning and deep learning and everything that will answer your question, maybe, because it simulates, it's a simulation, and will incorporate also this in the simulation with the same input-output relationship of myself or Mathieu, for what matters, exactly the same input-output relationship. But then you have to see how, what's done, it's been done inside. And then you have to pick inside what are the mechanisms. And you could do that just by multiplying the number of elements. So you can do it with the brain, with a few elements constituting a very complex network, and or with a simple feed-forward system made of trillions of elements, which are very fast, but it's nothing because it's not even one system. It's a collection of many. So ontologically, it doesn't even exist as one thing, but it has the same input and output relationship. So you're dealing with something that is an aggregate of, elements, and does the same thing as you do, and much better than a locked-in patient. So that's the problem with the functionalistic approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think there is another question here, and then you, yes, and then other people, of course. Yes.
Yes, I have a question for both the scientists and the meditators. Assuming there is generally a common view about subjectivity, so there is a conundrum, a paradox. The scientists, when they speak about the mind, they need to rely on a model, or somehow on a meta-language or on scientific formulas. And so they don't see directly the mind, but they are able to communicate what they describe to the others in order to get the feedback and to see whether their view of reality is true or not. On the other hand, the meditators do see in a non-dual way the mind, but they are unable to communicate to the others. So the question for the scientist is, how can you, as a scientist, have a non-dual vision of mind? And the question for the meditators is how you can communicate effectively what you actually, quote-unquote, see to the others.
Thank you. That's a good question. Yes, Professor Prignola.
It's easy for a scientist. It must to start meditation. It's very easy.
Yes.
Exactly. Plus one more thing, there has to be an agreement on the meaning of words, right? I can communicate with another scientist if he understands my jargon. If I communicate to somebody that doesn't understand the jargon, it's meaningless, right? So that
Yes.
for the same token, I cannot communicate with somebody that had a mystical experience if one didn't have one. Because without that experience, there is no meaning to what I'm saying or to what the other one is saying.
Good. Thank you.
I disagree with both of them. You see, when you produce a model, that is, how has been called active meditation? This morning, His Holiness was distinguishing between different meditation. And there was one which I said to myself, I mean to my double, this is what you do every day. When you work out a model, you start with an hypothesis. That hypothesis might be very crazy. Since it is an hypothesis, it does not need to be justified a priori, only needs to be confirmed possibly at the end of the story, after you did it. So, if you are a mathematician, for example, you construct a set of postulates. These postulates are completely gratuitous. And this is a fully creative experience which only can arise if you are used to meditate about something which is yourself at the end of the story. So, I think that this is the point where we can meet. And I think that we do meet, because otherwise, as a physicist, I would be scared to be here, or I would say, this is not the place. I only talk with the physicist, or I only talk if there is some mathematics written somewhere. But it's not that the case. I am here just because I want to know what happens to me when I put down an hypothesis. The most difficult thing is to put the pen on the paper, the first one, or the finger on the first key in a computer, if you have a computer. So at that level, that is, how it's called? Active meditation? I do not know how it's called, but that, to me, is meditation. And it is not possible without a very long training. I do not remember to whom I was telling this, but my father was a painter. And I thought by doing physics to take a completely different road from me. Now I know that I'm doing exactly the same thing. When I have a formula, it is a plastic. I just squeeze it, smash it, to let it describe what. And this is completely out of the world experience.
Thank you. So from the contemplative side?
Yes. I really don't think in terms of whether we have a consciousness or not. Both parties, I don't think there's any disagreement. We all know we have consciousness, although we may define slightly different ways. In this hall there are maybe 500 people. We all know we are conscious. You are listening, you are thinking, and there's no doubt on that. So in that sense, scientists and contemplative meditators, I don't think there's any disagreement. Now here, the meditators, the main purpose is not to understand consciousness, because consciousness is here. The purpose of the meditation is to enhance certain qualities of the consciousness, of the mind. such as single-pointed, such as love, compassion, wisdom. That is the purpose of meditation. So the meditators, contemplative meditators, main purpose is not to understand consciousness, it is to enhance certain properties of the consciousness.
Thank you. Matthew,
Just,
can you communicate something?
yeah, the
about-
communication. So,
Yes.
yes, so of course we say that ultimately, what I just mentioned in words as the pure awareness, self-illuminating, etc., blah, 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 we actually say, yes, but in fact, it's beyond words, it's beyond concepts, it's beyond images, beyond symbol. So you say, well, too bad, then you cannot communicate with anyone who wants to study it. So we have this image of pointing a finger to the moon. Don't look at the finger, look at the moon. So you might say it's an easy escape. I just escape the question, elude the question, and refer you to something else. But what does that really mean, pointing a finger at the moon? I cannot describe the moon, because maybe you are looking the other side. But if I point the finger, I give you a path or a direction so that you can look at the moon and no amount of description will fully replace the experience of seeing the moon. But I point at the direction. So if I say to someone, look at what's behind the screen of discursive thoughts. And usually people say, what are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense. I say, well, please. Try to see, all this blah, 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 the neuron chatters or whatever you call it, that noise, thoughts, all the time. Is there something behind that? This is kind of pure faculty of knowing. If it doesn't make any sense, just point the finger and then look. So that can be done. And then we have an interpersonal agreement. And we know somehow by sort of trying to use words, however inadequate they are ultimately, to confirm that somehow, and that's also why relating, and that's not the usual setup in the laboratories, to someone who has a much deeper experience about that and can somehow further guide you in more subtle ways of reaching to that and say, oh no, this is not that. You are just sort of a dull perception of the world. That's not the sort of the most clear one. So things like that. So gradually, by pointing further and further to different moons, you may reach there. So in a way, it's not that you cannot fully communicate it, but you can induce someone to guide someone or help someone to have this experience. So it's not that it's just two different words that just can't talk at all. But it has to go through the experience. Otherwise, we're just talking.
Thank you. So, next question. Good. Some question.
No, yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their great talks and comments. And as a linguist, I found Professor Fagin's talk especially fascinating because the interface, the morphosyntax semantics interface is one of my main research questions. So, but as regards your model, I was wondering how your model can address the long debated question of the interaction between perception and cognition, between percepts and concepts, which is one of the main open questions in cognitive sciences and neurosciences. And related to this, and more concretely, quotation, what do we actually mean by saying that consciousness units live independently or even before MEST, the matter and energy in the space-time? So,
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So in my model, there are two fundamental properties of consciousness. There are others, but there are the two fundamental properties related to language. Is the perception of the symbol, which is quale, symbols qualia, and then the comprehension of the symbol, which is the cognitive function. So I get the meaning of the quality. So those two are fundamentally different processes. They're not one and the same. And in fact, in the study of consciousness, they're never clearly expressed. The hard problem of consciousness is really the qualia problem, but nobody actually has said much about the hardest problem of consciousness, which is meaning, getting the meaning out of qualia. Okay, that's not something that has been studied much, and of course, that's why also in linguistics is an issue that hasn't been resolved. But it is consciousness that is capable to get the meaning out of a symbol. It's not within the symbol the meaning. Just no way. Nor is it in the perception of the symbol.
Right, but does consciousness exist independently of the processing of the combination of a form and the meaning? So without accessing and processing and experiencing or whatever, the combination of forms and functions, do we have a real consciousness in your idea or any other? Do we have a system, a coherent system, without the processing of this combination? Or doesn't consciousness always has to refer to the processing of the combination of forms and function, or how to say, meanings and symbols, whatever?
But consciousness can get meaning also without symbols, but that's consciousness, okay? Conscious energy. Conscious energy, by the way, doesn't need to exist physically in this physical world. In my model, conscious energy, which was the second question that you asked, before physical world, before MEST, there are consciousness units. They exist in a space that I call C space. I don't know, I cannot express it what it is because I don't know what it is, but it is the semantic space. It's the space where there is meaning by the observation, the direct observation of consciousness to other conscious entities. So these conscious entities exist not in this physical reality, okay? So then, because these conscious entities wish to communicate with each other, they have to create symbols in order to communicate, okay? What do they want to communicate? They want to communicate the meaning that they have about themselves or about what they perceive about some other self, some other conscious entity. Therefore, they need to create symbols that are understandable by other conscious entities. That's the origin, what will eventually become physical reality. The combination of symbols and the syntactical laws that regulate how symbols are combined. Those syntactical laws are the precursors of what we perceive as physical laws when we are embodied and we make experiments on what we believe to be physical reality. You see, it's a very complex system. In other words, we are many layers removed from the nature of this energy that is self-reflective. But ultimately, there is a fundamental distinction to be made between symbolic reality, which is just ripples in this energy, which is perceived as a symbol, and that requires this capacity of comprehension, which is innate in this energy. There is no way that in other words, even a baby, which is a combination of consciousness and physical matter, a baby can actually begin to recognize when there is something that is not part of what they are perceiving, something that they can abstract and say, oh, that might mean something else. So they begin to separate background from foreground. They can begin to separate the context from the content. That requires intuition. A machine cannot do that. A machine cannot do that. You have to give it a context which is implicit in the way you program the machine. We actually begin to understand naturally, intrinsically, the context upon which a symbol has meaning or potential meaning. But we know that there is a symbol even if we don't know the meaning. Then we can understand the meaning eventually. Therefore, we can begin to create communications.
This resembles language systems a lot.
Thank you. So there is another question in the back of the room. Can you bring the microphone there? Thank you. This lady here.
Buonasera a tutti. Io volevo rivolgere la domanda a tutti,
I'd like
quindi
to raise this question
a
for
tutti i relatori.
all the panelists.
Allora, si è parlato di coscienza. Ecco, la mia domanda era
So we've
questa.
been talking
Volevo
about consciousness. My question
capire,
is, I'd like to
e
understand
la domanda è se la coscienza può essere localizzata, è locale o non locale,
consciousness is local
e
or
la differenza tra
non-local.
coscienza
And the
e
difference
consapevolezza.
between consciousness and awareness.
Se si può parlare di, visto che si è parlato di energia, che tutto è energia, quindi che tutto si trasforma, se possiamo dire che la coscienza è una trasformazione, una tramutazione di un livello di energia da una qualità sottile ad una qualità più densa.
Thank you. So of course, the three of you and even Massimo understood, but I have to translate that into English for Mathieu and Yeshe. So the point was, is consciousness local or non-local? Is it a form of energy that is, so to speak, elevated from gross to subtle? And also there was another point. Yes, the difference between, well, this was difficult because it was the difference between two words in Italian that are usually translated by consciousness, coscienza e consapevolezza. I would translate that by what is the difference between consciousness and reflective consciousness, something like that. Awareness, maybe, yes, okay. Good, thank you. I'm not sure it's exactly the same, but... Yes.
Actually, yeah, let's go with the physicists first. Because
Okay, well, of course, I see the questions from my perspective of this model in which there is a subject and it's double. In this case, consciousness is spread out, is in between. And in this sense, could be said non-local, even though non-local, strictly speaking, in physics has a very definite meaning. But let's say that is non-local in a loose sense. I was saying this morning, you are in my consciousness, I'm in yours, and so on. In this sense, it's non-local because it belongs to the subject and to the environment. It's the dialogue between the subject and its double. There is a page in Borges which is beautiful and is I and Borges. And I discovered this page after I was writing about my double. So you might look for that page, it's a beautiful page. The distinction between how at the end you decide should say in English, consciousness and?
Consapevolezza.
What?
Awareness, they said, yes.
Awareness.
Awareness, yes.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay. You see, from an operational point of view, you are driving, and you have to react to something which comes from outside. Let's say a red light, a stop with a red light. Then you push your foot on the brake. Now, that is a significant action, and it is also meaningful one, in the sense that you have to stop. Of course, if that one is the red light where you have to stop, in Naples, not always the red lights are those where you have to stop. But in any case, there is a distinction between significant and meaningful. No, it's not. No. It's not, I'm not talking about optional. Meaningful means something that for you has a meaning. That one is most near to a consciousness, as usually we. Meaningful. Significant is something which you have to do. Even if you are thinking, you stop your car. But for example, if someone is crossing the street and we are going and you stop, that is even meaningful. So there are subtle distinctions between the two things. Then there was another part of the questions, which one was this consciousness and awareness? Oh. Transformation of consciousness? Energy.
About energy.
Energy. Please. Okay. There was before, Professor Fogin, he was saying we should agree on the meaning of words. Now, the word energy in physics is a very specific word, is something very, I mean, you cannot escape. So I would not speak in any case of something energy of somewhere. So I would not call words, call inside the discussion words which have a well-defined meaning. The word meaning now is coming. In some context. So I try to do not use the word energy out of a place from a physical point of view. So when you were saying energy concentrated, what you were saying, please remind me. You were saying...
Pronto?
Sì.
Sì, no, parlavo di energia dal punto di vista fisico, sostanza. La tramutazione intendo da uno stato sottile ad uno stato più denso, che si è parlato di localizzare la coscienza nel cervello, ma si può parlare e dire che la coscienza è ovunque? Non è localizzata in un aspetto, ma è ovunque?
I would hold thinking in that way, because consciousness, as I was meaning, is our dialogue in this sense. It is a conscious dialogue. We are trying to understand each other. So in this sense, but this sottile and dense, they can mean everything. For every one of us, they have a different meaning. So I will not use those words. I will not use the word energy and matter, because that transmutation holds in a very special case at very high speed. Normally, energy has nothing to do with matter. Is a force times a displacement. So I would remain grounded. Otherwise, we really fly away and we risk to say things which have no reason to be said.
Okay, Massimo.
About the difference between consciousness and awareness, I mean, it's difficult to, because we use it as synonymous, sort of. But I think it's a very interesting question, which also relates to your question, which was unanswered in the second part. What's the difference between consciousness and the mind?
Yes.
You asked that, which is, we save it for tomorrow.
Okay.
Otherwise, what do we say tomorrow? But consciousness and awareness in a way, at least in the way I perceive the term in the literature, and it's as consciousness is larger than awareness. Awareness might be, as an object. Consciousness, to me, refers more to a capacity, a general capacity, a potential, which is even larger than awareness, which sounds to me, at least, more actual. Well, you use awareness often now when you have these levels and awareness. Consciousness is defined by levels and awareness. And awareness refers to a content, and the level is the capacity. So I would say what's the fundamental thing, although I don't agree with the term level because we don't know what it means, but, you know, consciousness refers more to a general capacity. It's much larger, and if you know, and it's a potential. It's a huge potential, and it's what resonates, you know, when you say this luminous state without a specific content, which is more, you know, it sounds to me like you are referring to this potential without, which is not actual. It doesn't matter what the brain is actually doing at that very time, whether it's engaging in some specific, you know, function. It's an open capacity which takes or embraces the whole full repertoire, which is huge, but it's not actual. It's potential. So in this sense, I think that there is a difference, and I think consciousness is broader in my understanding.
Yeah, this is interesting because it's a definition. You try to make the difference between consciousness and awareness on the basis of the idea that awareness has an object or is directed towards something. And now you know that there are other definitions which date back to the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, in which he said consciousness is always consciousness of something. So he had this idea of consciousness in view, and also he understood that there were other forms, I would call that forms of consciousness, in which the object is no longer necessary. So it's a matter a little bit of words and definition. So, Mathieu.
I fully agree with Massimos. Simply, I will just reverse the word, but it's a question of vocabulary.
Yes.
So I will just warn you, because tomorrow I'm going to use awareness as the most basic faculty, but it's purely a question of vocabulary. But just to answer about this kind of question about localization, I think it's, but it really depends on what you call localization. So subjective experience, I think now, of course, I'm localized here. Now, if I think of what made me think of something, and then if I see the almost numberless or infinite causes and conditions that made me have this experience, then definitely interdependence cannot be localized. For the very reason that localization would mean that there are intrinsic properties that are localized anywhere in the world. And something that's one of the main tenets of Buddhist philosophy is such autonomous entity that will exist from its own side. It just doesn't belong to that universe. There's no such thing. We can actually demonstrate it to logical, analytical meditation, as John has said. So there's no place in the phenomenal world for something that exists on its own, autonomously independent of something else. So therefore, that strict definition of localization as intrinsic properties belonging to some entity, that cannot be. But in terms of subjectivity, yes. So it all depends what you call localization.
Thank you very much, Tashi.
I think the first part of what I want to say is, as you mentioned, the usage of the word. When you say awareness, then maybe you can interpret it as a lesser spread than the consciousness, because when you say awareness, then you are talking about aware of something. When you say consciousness, not necessarily conscious of something. In that sense, you may say the consciousness is larger than the awareness, but from the basic Indo-Buddhist understanding, these two are basically same. Awareness, consciousness. In Tibetan law, Rigpa, Sheba, these are synonymous. That means awareness, the consciousness, and the law, Rigpa, Sheba. Now, so these are synonymous. So in the basic level, it is very much dependent on how you interpret the words awareness. Now, the second thing which I want to look at a little bit is I don't want to talk about location, the energy. I agree with the professor. When you talk about energy, then your discussion or your topic may go, ooh, in a very strange energy. But here it is quite important, particularly from the Indo-Buddhist tradition, and within that, the Buddhist mysticism, you can say that, or the Vajrayana tradition, the consciousness is supported by the energy. And there is a particular the analogy is used. The consciousness and the energy are an analogy is used. Two people, one person who is a cripple but has an extremely good sight, one person who has an extremely good leg but blind. When these two people work together, they can function perfectly. The very good leg person carries the cripple who has a good sight. When they go together, they can function properly. Similar to that, that's the analogy you use. Similar to that, consciousness to function, to engage in their object, whatever that might be, it is through the energy. Now, the energy should not be understood something outside there. It is within the individuals. Individuals, that there are the description of different types of energies. In Tibetan, term is used lung. Sometimes it's translated wind. Sometimes translated energies. There are different types of energies are explained. It is not energy, some kind of strange out there. It is the individuals. This physiological structure produces certain type of energy which consciousness to function, to engage in their objects.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Pregnolato.
I want to give you another point of view. According to the neuroscientist, classical neuroscientist, a human being has a brain that perceives the reality from outside. It elaborates all this information, became self-awareness of the reality, and they call this is the consciousness. So for a neuroscientist, the model is quite easy. If you shoot down a man in the brain, he falls down dead, and the consciousness is finished. Very easy. But if you have a look from the quantum biology point of view, you must assume that in some kind of proteins, you can have a quantum computation. So it generates quantum consciousness. This kind of consciousness is not local, okay? So when you shoot down a man, probably this kind of quantum computation still continue for a while until all this kind of proteins dissolve completely. So the consciousness, the quantum consciousness, is still continue after the death for a while, I don't know how long, but it still continue, and is not local. This is, I think, in the traditional study of Buddhism, this kind of view, that nothing is ending with the death of the body. So it's different. If you want to consider consciousness according to the official medicine and the classical point of view, it stops after the death because you lose consciousness and you lose self-awareness and the perceive because the brain is dead. But if you are looking to the human being as something more complex, and you consider that the consciousness is not only classical but also quantum, it's still living after the death of the body for a while. Then it can be embedded down to the Planck scale and remain there as a remember of the past life. Maybe in some, I don't know how, maybe it can be recovered, as said this morning, His Holiness, and you can remember some kind of remembering of the past life. So we need to distinguish the classical consciousness that is finished with the brain or the quantum consciousness that is something more complex and probably not local. Probably not local. This is my point of view.
Professor Massimini.
Thank you. Although there are some evidences for locality, because if I were to shoot this person in the cerebellum, which has 80% of the neurons within the skull, and proteins, microtubules, and everything, then, if I remove that cerebellum, as far as I'm concerned, as a patient, nothing changes in my conscience. Where if I, get shot or if I'm anesthetized in the cerebral cortex rather than in the cerebellum, everything, at least as far as I can tell by a first-person perspective, changes. So there is some evidence for locality, at least within our skull. And what should explain that also if you are, endorsing a quantum consciousness perspective? So what is the difference between the microtubules and the proteins in the cerebellum as opposed to the ones in the cerebral cortex, for instance? That would be an interesting prediction and something interesting to study, whether there's a key difference there. So locality, I agree. I mean, we don't know, it can be diffuse, it can be, but in a way, when you go to this physical substrate and you have to design experiments or some sort of investigation, this has to be considered. And one question is, what do you think is different there between these two structures, for instance?
Do you want to answer, Professor?
I want also to consider the glia and the microglia. There are not only neurons in the brain, but there are also these very important cells. And all the organization of these networks, the glia networks and the neuron networks, work together in generating what we call neurocorrelate of consciousness. So when you are talking as a physiologist of consciousness, in this case you are talking about a neurocorrelate of consciousness, not of quantum consciousness, that can be defined very differently. So we are taking, we need an agreement in the using of the term consciousness.
Yeah. Thank you. You want to add something? Yeah. Yes.
I just want to respond briefly to the issue of calling energy with a capital E the seat of MEST, which is the energy, matter, space, and time that emerge from this larger energy with a capital E that has this capacity to self-reflect, to know itself. So I use energy because what do you call the seed that comes out to create the Big Bang? What is it called? That has everything, right, which is physical. So, and everything that is physical is all connected together. So I use the word energy, but with a capital E, to make a distinction. It's a distinction. Okay, but that's good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
No, my is that every day, if you are in a bus or on the train, people talk of energy. I mean, please be calm. So okay. In this sense, there is another question about locality. Well, we should make a distinction between local and non-local properties, which are functional, I mean mathematical properties of some expression. But you were mentioning about localization. Where is consciousness? Not about being local or non-local. Now, in the question, I understood that she was asking about non-locality in the sense of the everyday talking in quantum mechanics and so. But
no, but indeed, I was more referring to his point.
Yes. But one more possibility about your question is that microtubula have nothing to do with consciousness. From a scientific point of view, I mean, we have no information, clear information. Also, the anesthetics, which take out consciousness, maybe they do not take out consciousness, they take out some intermediate step out of which consciousness will come. What I want to say is that the problem is fully open, And we should not be, I was saying His Holiness this morning, aggressive in any way, something which had to do with aggressive. We should say the situation is this one. And we, at the moment, we have no clear picture of a biological, in the sense of molecular biology, connection with consciousness. My opinion is that it is a macroscopic quantum phenomena, so it's a process which you reach as a result of the complexity of such a quantum system, which is a living system, a living brain.
Okay, now I think time is over, but I want to conclude with a question I received on the paper, and which can serve as a conclusion, actually. The question is this one: can the quantum physical revolution be interpreted as a chance for Western scientists to just answer sometimes "I don't know," without being ashamed of it?
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.